It was a warm summer night, and my friends and I had decided to take a hike in the nearby woods. We had heard rumors of a leprechaun sighting in the area, but we didn't pay it much attention. After all, it was just a myth, right? As we were hiking through the dense forest, I started to feel uneasy. It was as if we were being watched. My friends dismissed my fears, saying that it was just the rustling of leaves and the wind. But I knew that something wasn't right. We continued on our hike until we reached a clearing. That's when we saw it. A small figure, no more than 2 feet tall, was standing in front of us. It had a mischievous grin on its face, and its eyes glinted with a sinister light. I could feel my heart racing as the leprechaun approached us. It was carrying a small pot of gold in its hand, and it seemed to be inviting us to follow it. My friends were fascinated by the creature, but I knew that we should stay away. However, before I could warn them, the leprechaun disappeared into the woods. My friends immediately ran after it, but I hesitated. Something about the situation felt off. I decided to wait and watch from a distance. As I hid behind a tree, I could hear my friends laughing and shouting in excitement. But then, the atmosphere changed. Their voices became muffled and distant, and the woods grew eerily silent. That's when I saw the leprechaun emerge from the trees. It was no longer smiling. Its face was twisted into a malevolent expression, and its eyes glowed with a sinister light. I knew that I had to act fast. I ran towards my friends, screaming for them to leave the woods. But it was too late. They were already under the leprechaun's spell. As I got closer, I saw that the leprechaun had transformed. It was no longer a harmless creature, but a grotesque and terrifying monster. Its skin was green and mottled, and its teeth were razor sharp. I knew that we were in grave danger. But I didn't give up. I grabbed my friends by the arms and pulled them towards the wood's edge. As we ran, I could hear the leprechaun's laughter echoing through the trees. We made it out of the woods safely, but I'll never forget that night. The leprechaun encounter was one of the scariest moments of my life, and it's a reminder that we should never underestimate the power of myths and legends. It was a dark and stormy night, and I was driving home from work. The rain was coming down in sheets, and I could barely see the road in front of me. I was driving slowly, trying to navigate through the slick and slippery streets when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was a small child standing in the middle of the road, but as I got closer, I realized it was something much more sinister. Standing in the middle of the road was a leprechaun, and it was unlike any leprechaun I had ever seen before. This one was much taller than the ones you see in movies, and it had long, sharp claws instead of the usual gold coins. Its eyes glowed a bright green, and its teeth were razor sharp. I slammed on the brakes and tried to swerve to avoid the creature, but it was too late. The leprechaun jumped on the hood of my car and started clawing at the windshield. I could hear its nails scraping against the glass, and I could feel the car shaking under its weight. I was terrified, and I didn't know what to do. I tried to roll down the window and scream for help, but the leprechaun was too strong. It grabbed my arm with its sharp claws, and I could feel the blood trickling down my skin. Just when I thought it was all over, the leprechaun suddenly let go and ran off into the night. I was left alone in my car, shaking and bleeding. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew that I had narrowly escaped a deadly encounter with a supernatural creature. To this day, I still don't know what that leprechaun wanted from me, but I know that I never want to encounter it again. I learned that night that the world is full of dark and mysterious creatures, and it's best to stay away from them if you value your life. I'm not one to believe in folklore or superstitions, but what happened to me last night has me questioning everything. I was out for a late night walk, trying to clear my head after a long day at work. It was a quiet night, with a gentle breeze blowing and the moon casting an eerie glow over the empty streets. As I was walking, I noticed a small figure in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a child out late, but as I got closer, I realized that it was a leprechaun. Yes, a leprechaun, with a green top hat, curly-toed shoes, and a mischievous grin on his face. I didn't know what to do. I had never seen a leprechaun before, let alone in the middle of a city. But before I could even process what was happening, the leprechaun darted off into an alleyway. I couldn't resist my curiosity and followed him. The alley was dark and narrow, with barely enough room for me to walk through. As I got deeper into the alley, I could hear the leprechaun's laughter echoing off the walls. I was getting closer, but the alley seemed to go on forever. Suddenly, I heard a rustling in the shadows. I froze in fear as the leprechaun appeared from behind a dumpster. His eyes were dark and menacing, and his grin had turned into a snarl. "You shouldn't have followed me," he hissed. "You're mine now." I turned to run, but it was too late. The leprechaun was too fast, and before I knew it, he had me in his grip. His fingers were cold and clammy, and I could feel his breath on my neck. "You're going to make me rich," he whispered in my ear. I struggled and fought, but the leprechaun was too strong. Just when I thought it was all over, a bright light flashed and the leprechaun disappeared. I was left alone in the alley, panting and shaking with fear. I stumbled out of the alley and into the street, my heart pounding in my chest. I had never been so scared in my life. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew that I had narrowly escaped something dangerous. As I walked home, I couldn't help but wonder if what I had seen was real or just my imagination. But deep down, I knew that I had come face to face with a leprechaun, and that I had lived to tell the tale. I never believed in leprechauns until the day I had a close encounter with one. It was a warm summer evening, and I had just finished hiking through the forest. As I made my way back to my car, I spotted a small figure sitting on a rock by the side of the path. At first, I thought it was a child, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. The figure was no taller than a foot and had a pointed hat and a long, bushy beard. It was dressed in green and gold, and it held a small pot in its hands. I couldn't believe my eyes. I was face to face with a leprechaun. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The leprechaun looked up and locked eyes with me. Its expression was cold and calculating, and I suddenly felt very vulnerable. I tried to back away slowly, but the leprechaun sprang to its feet and started running towards me. I turned and ran as fast as I could, but the leprechaun was surprisingly fast. It kept getting closer and closer, and I could feel its hot breath on the back of my neck. Just when I thought it was going to catch me, I stumbled and fell to the ground. I scrambled to my feet and turned to face the leprechaun. It was standing just a few feet away, its eyes blazing with fury. I could feel its power radiating off of it, and I knew I was in serious trouble. Suddenly, the leprechaun let out a blood-curdling scream and charged towards me. I threw my arms up to defend myself, but the leprechaun was too fast. It hit me like a freight train, knocking me to the ground. As I lay there, dazed and disoriented, the leprechaun disappeared into the woods. I never saw it again, but the memory of that encounter still haunts me to this day. I learned the hard way that leprechauns aren't just harmless little creatures from fairy tales. They're powerful and dangerous, and encountering one can be a terrifying and life-changing experience. I never believed in leprechauns. I thought they were just a myth, a tale to scare little children. But that all changed one night when I had a close encounter with one. It was a dark and stormy night, and I was driving home from work. The roads were slick and the rain was coming down in sheets. As I drove down a quiet country road, I saw something moving in the shadows. At first, I thought it was just a deer, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. It was a small creature, no taller than my waist, with bright green clothing and a mischievous grin on its face. It was a leprechaun. I couldn't believe my eyes. I thought I was hallucinating, but then the leprechaun spoke to me. "Hello there, human. What brings you out on this stormy night?" it said, its voice like a tinkling bell. I was too scared to answer, too scared to even move. The leprechaun noticed my fear and chuckled. "Don't be afraid, human. I won't hurt you, unless you try to steal my gold," it said, patting a small pouch at its waist. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to steal its gold, but I also didn't want to stick around and find out what would happen if I did. So, I quickly got back in my car and drove away as fast as I could. I thought I had escaped the leprechaun's grasp, but as I drove down the road, I realized it was following me. It was running alongside my car, its tiny feet moving faster than I could have ever imagined. I was so scared that I didn't know what to do. But then, the leprechaun suddenly stopped and disappeared into the woods. I never saw it again after that night, but I still think about it often. I never knew leprechauns were real, and I never want to encounter one again. I never thought I would have a reason to believe in leprechauns, but after what happened to me, I don't think I can deny their existence anymore. It was a warm summer evening and I decided to take a walk in the nearby woods. I loved the peacefulness of nature, the rustling of leaves and the sound of birds chirping. But that day, something felt off. As I walked deeper into the woods, I began to feel like I was being watched. I looked around but saw nothing out of the ordinary. I shrugged it off and continued my walk. After a while, I found myself in a clearing surrounded by tall trees. That's when I saw him. A little man, no taller than my knee, was standing in front of me, staring right at me. He was dressed in green, had a long beard and a hat with a buckle on it. I couldn't believe my eyes. I had heard stories about leprechauns, but I never thought I would actually see one. He spoke to me in a high-pitched voice, "Well, hello there, lass. What brings you to my woods?" I was too scared to answer, but he didn't seem to mind. He continued, "You're lucky I found you before the others did. They can be quite dangerous, you know." "Others?" I asked, confused. "The other leprechauns," he replied. "They don't take kindly to humans trespassing on their land. But I'll make you a deal. If you can catch me, I'll grant you a wish." I didn't know what to do. I wasn't sure if I could trust him, but I was also curious about what my wish would be. So I ran after him. He led me deeper into the woods, through thorny bushes and muddy puddles. But no matter how fast I ran, he always stayed just out of reach. Suddenly, I heard a loud rustling behind me. I turned around and saw a group of leprechauns, all dressed in green and looking angry. "We told you to leave, human," one of them shouted. I realized then that I had been tricked. The leprechaun I had been chasing had led me straight into the hands of the others. I ran as fast as I could, but they were too quick. They caught up to me and started pulling at my clothes and scratching at my skin. I was screaming for help, but no one came. I thought I was going to die there, in the middle of the woods, at the hands of these little creatures. But then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they disappeared. The leprechauns just vanished into thin air, leaving me alone and terrified. I stumbled out of the woods, scratched and bruised, but alive. I never went back there again, and I never spoke of what happened to anyone. But every time I see something green, or hear a rustling in the bushes, I can't help but wonder if the leprechauns are watching me, waiting for their next victim. I never believed in leprechauns until I had a close encounter with one. It was a warm summer evening, and I was hiking in the forest behind my house. As I walked deeper into the woods, I began to feel a sense of unease. The trees were thicker here, and the leaves blocked out most of the sunlight, casting strange shadows on the ground. Suddenly, I heard a rustling noise behind me. I turned around to see a small figure dart behind a nearby tree. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but then I noticed the red hat and green jacket. It was a leprechaun. I froze in fear as the leprechaun stepped out from behind the tree. He was tiny, no more than a foot tall, but his eyes burned with an intense fire. I could feel his malevolent energy emanating from his tiny frame. The leprechaun grinned at me and beckoned me closer. His voice was high-pitched and sinister, and I could hear him whispering something in Gaelic. I took a step back, but he continued to follow me, his eyes fixed on mine. I knew I had to get out of there, and fast. I turned around and ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. The leprechaun was hot on my heels, his tiny footsteps pounding the forest floor. Just as I thought he was about to catch me, I saw a clearing up ahead. I sprinted towards it, feeling the leprechaun's breath on my neck. As I burst into the clearing, I turned around to face my pursuer. The leprechaun was gone. I looked around, but there was no sign of him. I realized then that I had narrowly escaped a close encounter with a malevolent spirit, and I shuddered at the thought of what might have happened if I had been caught. From that day on, I stayed away from the woods behind my house. I never wanted to have another encounter with a leprechaun, or any other malevolent spirit, ever again. It was St. Patrick's Day, and my friends and I were celebrating at a local pub. We were having a great time, drinking green beer and enjoying the festive atmosphere. As the night went on, I noticed a man at the bar who seemed out of place. He was short, with wild red hair and a long beard, and he was dressed in a green suit and hat. At first, I thought he was just another partygoer dressed up for the occasion, but something about him gave me a creepy feeling. He kept staring at me with his beady little eyes, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was sizing me up. Eventually, I decided to leave the pub and head back to my apartment. I said goodbye to my friends and stepped out into the chilly night air. As I was walking down the deserted street, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw the same strange man from the pub, shamrock-shaped pupils dilated, rapidly approaching. He leered at me and spoke in a thick Irish accent, "You're a lucky one, you know that. Not everyone gets to see me, but since it's St. Paddy's Day, I'll give you a little gift." Before I could react, the man lunged at me, his fingers curling into razor-sharp claws. I barely managed to dodge his attack and stumbled backward. As I regained my balance, I saw the man was now standing on his tiptoes, looking more like a tiny goblin than a human being. "You think you can run away from me? Ha," he chortled. "I'll be seeing you soon, lad. You'll never forget me." With that, the leprechaun disappeared into thin air, leaving me alone and trembling with fear. I still don't know what that thing wanted from me or what kind of gift it was planning to give me, but I'm grateful I got away with my life. Every St. Patrick's Day, I make sure to stay far away from any leprechauns, just in case. I never believed in leprechauns until the day I saw one with my own two eyes. It was a few years ago when I was backpacking through the lush green hills of Ireland. I had always been fascinated by the country's folklore and legends, and I was excited to explore its rich history. One day, while hiking through a dense forest, I stumbled upon a small clearing. It was there that I saw something that chilled me to the bone. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I looked closer, I saw a small figure dancing in the center of the clearing. It was a leprechaun, with bright red hair, green coat, and a pointy hat. I couldn't believe my eyes. Leprechauns were supposed to be a myth, a legend passed down from generation to generation. Yet, there it was, in all its tiny glory. As I stood there, frozen in fear and amazement, the leprechaun suddenly turned its head and locked eyes with me. Its eyes were an unnatural shade of green, and they seemed to glow in the dim light. Before I could react, the leprechaun started to run towards me, its tiny feet pounding against the ground. I tried to run, but my legs felt heavy, like they were made of stone. I stumbled and fell, and the leprechaun was upon me in an instant. It was then that I saw the look in its eyes, a cold and calculating stare that seemed to penetrate my soul. I knew then that this was no friendly fairy tale creature, but a malevolent force that meant me harm. I don't remember how I managed to escape, but I stumbled out of the forest, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew then that I had come face to face with something that was beyond my understanding, something that should never have existed. To this day, I don't know what the leprechaun wanted from me, but I know that I was lucky to survive that encounter. I don't talk about it much, for fear that others will think me crazy, but I know what I saw, and I'll never forget that terrorizing experience. I never really believed in leprechauns until that night. I was out camping with my friends in the woods, and we were telling ghost stories around the campfire. It was all fun and games until someone mentioned the legend of the leprechauns. I scoffed at the idea of little green men running around the forest, stealing pots of gold. But then, in the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange noise outside our tent. At first, I thought it was just an animal rustling around in the underbrush. But then I heard a high-pitched giggle, like a child's laugh. And then I saw it, a small figure, no taller than my knee, standing just outside the tent. It was dressed in green, with a pointed hat and a bushy red beard. It looked like a leprechaun straight out of a storybook. But this was no cute, cartoonish creature. Its eyes were dark and glinting, and its grin was twisted and malevolent. I froze, unable to move or speak. The leprechaun just stood there, staring at me with its beady eyes. And then, with a sudden burst of speed, it darted forward and grabbed hold of my ankle. I screamed, thrashing around in the tent, trying to shake off the leprechaun's grip. It felt like its fingers were made of steel, digging into my skin and refusing to let go. But then, out of nowhere, my friends burst out of their own tent and started shouting and making noise. The leprechaun released me and vanished into the darkness, giggling all the while. I was shaken to my core by the encounter. I couldn't believe that leprechauns were real, and that I had come face to face with one. But I was also grateful that I had survived. Who knows what that little creature would have done to me if my friends hadn't intervened. From that day forward, I never underestimated the power of legends and myths. And I never went camping in the woods without bringing along some protective charms and amulets, just in case any other supernatural creatures decided to pay me a visit. It was a beautiful day in early spring, and I decided to take a hike in the nearby woods. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and the trees were just starting to bud. It was the perfect day for a hike. Little did I know, however, that this hike would be one that I would never forget. As I was walking along the path, I suddenly saw something move out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just a bird or a squirrel, but as I looked closer, I realized that it was something much more unusual. It was a tiny little man, dressed in green, with a pointed hat and a mischievous grin on his face. At first, I couldn't believe my eyes. Was this really a leprechaun? I had heard stories about these mythical creatures, but I had never actually seen one before. As I stood there, frozen in amazement, the leprechaun started to speak to me. "Top of the morning to you, lad," he said in a thick Irish accent. "What brings you to the woods on this fine day?" I didn't know what to say. I was completely caught off guard by this strange encounter. But before I could reply, the leprechaun spoke again. "I'll tell you what, lad. If you follow me, I'll take you to my pot of gold. It's hidden deep in these woods, and I could use a strong young man like yourself to help me dig it up." Part of me wanted to follow the leprechaun, just to see where he would take me. But another part of me was wary. I had heard stories about leprechauns and their tricks. I wasn't sure I could trust this little man, no matter how charming he seemed. "I'm sorry," I said, shaking my head. "I don't think I can help you with that." The leprechaun's grin disappeared, and his eyes narrowed. Suddenly, he didn't seem so friendly anymore. "Suit yourself," he said, his voice turning cold. "But let me give you a warning, lad. If you ever come back to these woods, you'd better watch your step. There are things here that you can't even imagine, and they won't hesitate to take advantage of a foolish young man like yourself." With that, the leprechaun turned and disappeared into the underbrush. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Had I really just seen a leprechaun? And had he really just threatened me? As I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle in the leaves, every snap of a twig, made my heart race. I knew that I had narrowly escaped a dangerous situation, but I also knew that I had gotten too close to something that I didn't understand. From that day forward, I never went hiking in those woods again. And every time I heard a strange noise in the night, I couldn't help but wonder if the leprechaun was watching me, waiting for his chance to strike. It was a warm summer night, and I had decided to go for a walk in the nearby forest to clear my mind. As I was walking through the dense trees, I noticed a small figure darting between the trunks. I assumed it was an animal, so I kept walking. But the figure seemed to be following me. Every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of it in the shadows, but as soon as I turned to get a better look, it would disappear. I started to feel uneasy. After a while, I decided to turn back and head home. But as I did, I saw the figure again, this time standing in the middle of the path. It was a small, mischievous-looking creature with a pointed hat and a green jacket. I couldn't believe my eyes, it was a leprechaun. I froze in place as the leprechaun started to laugh, revealing sharp teeth that glinted in the moonlight. It beckoned me towards it, but I knew better than to follow it. I had heard stories about leprechauns, how they could lead you into traps and steal your soul. As I started to back away, the leprechaun's laughter turned into a blood-curdling scream. It was angry that I had refused its invitation. I started to run, but I could hear its laughter and screams echoing through the forest. It felt like hours as I ran, stumbling through the underbrush, branches, and thorns slashing at my skin. But finally, I saw the lights of my home through the trees. I burst through the door, gasping for breath. 4 days afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the leprechaun's twisted face, laughing and screaming at me. I knew that I had had a close call with danger, and I thanked my lucky stars that I had made it out alive. I always thought leprechauns were nothing but mythological creatures, the stuff of fairy tales and folklore. But that all changed one night when I had a terrifying encounter with one. It was a warm summer night and I was walking home from a friend's house after a late night hangout. As I walked down the deserted street, I heard a strange sound coming from the nearby bushes. I stopped in my tracks and listened intently. It sounded like someone was giggling. At first, I thought it might be a child playing a prank, but the sound grew louder and more sinister. Suddenly, a small figure emerged from the bushes, about the size of a child, but with an old man's face and a pointed hat. It was a leprechaun, and I couldn't believe my eyes. I froze in fear as the leprechaun approached me, his beady eyes locked onto mine. He grinned wickedly, revealing a mouthful of sharp teeth, and his voice was high-pitched and menacing. "I've been waiting for you," he said. "You've got something I want." I didn't know what he was talking about, but I knew I had to get away from him. I turned and ran as fast as I could, but I could hear his cackling laughter behind me. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel his hot breath on my neck. I ran faster and faster until I finally reached my house. I slammed the door shut and locked it, panting and sweating with fear. I never saw the leprechaun again, but I knew he was still out there, waiting for his chance to take whatever he wanted. From that day on, I made sure to avoid the bushes where I first saw him, and I always kept a lookout for any other strange creatures that might be lurking in the shadows. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't been able to run away from the leprechaun that night, but I know one thing for sure: I never want to see him again.